Hello BlueDriver Nation, Jim and Chris here again on this 2007 Honda Civic. Today we're going to tackle the serpentine belt and the belt tensioner. This is a great Fear No Fix video because this repair can be just a little bit tricky. Chris?
It can be really easy, or it can be really not easy. There's one bolt that decides how this job's going to go. We'll get more into it later, but hopefully everything will work out just great for you.
Our fingers are crossed that this goes good. These are the tools you need for the tensioner and belt.
We're going to start things off by removing the splash shield. Once it's gone, in through the wheel well, we're going to be able to see the tensioner, that pesky tensioner bolt. We're going to be able to see most of the pulleys. We're going to be able to get to the belt more easily, so it's going to make everything from this point on a lot easier. All right, to remove the clip, you take a trim removal tool or a screwdriver, pry it under the cap. You might need to work it a little bit. Pry down. This releases the clip, and then you can just pull. If you're lucky, it's going to come off like that, but you're probably going to break a few of them, so it might be a good idea to have a spare or two ready. There you go. First broken clip. Now we've got two clips in the wheel well. Right now we're on the driver's side. One right here and one on the back there. And then finally, there's a little tab right here that's usually in that hole. You can see it popped out on its own, but you might need to wiggle it a little bit just to pop it out. Now we'll go do the other side, which is exactly the same. To make things easier, we're going to take off the passenger side front wheel. You don't have to do this. Part of the reason we're doing it is because it'll just make it easier for us to show you what's going on. If you don't want to take the wheel off, what you can do is turn the wheel all the way to the right, and then you'll have enough room to get your arm in and you should be able to see what you're doing. Before you jack up the car, make sure the parking brake is on and the wheels are chocked. We're going to lift the car using the jack point behind the tow hook on the front subframe. And we're going to support the car with a jack stand on the factory jack point. The factory jack point is the thickest point right here. And you can see it kind of folds over on itself. We're going to take the wheel off using a 19mm socket. We're going to disconnect the battery by removing both clamps by disconnecting the 10mm bolts on each side. Negative first. Just to play it safe, we're going to take something like the cap off our penetrating oil and put it over the positive lead just so you can't accidentally short them out. In a perfect world, at this step, we'd loosen the 3 bolts holding the water pump pulley on. What you'll probably find is that they're seized, and as soon as you start applying torque, the water pump pulley just starts spinning. There's not enough tension in the bolt to hold it in place. It is worth trying first though, because you might get lucky. The water pump pulley is on the passenger side, about midway down the engine. You'll see it down here. The water pump pulley is right here. You can see there are 3 bolts. One on the left, one on the right, one on the bottom. If everything works out well, you can put a wrench on them, and the tension of the belts will hold the pulley steady enough to break the torque. In the real world, the belt's probably going to slip, so we're not going to do it at this stage, and we'll show you what to do if the belt slips later on. This also isn't 100% necessary, but just to make things easier, we're going to remove the alternator. There are 2 reasons. The first reason is that it just gives us a lot more room to work in. The alternator is kind of sitting right on top of our work area. The other thing is, I mentioned earlier that you might have some trouble getting the bolts loose that hold the water pump pulley on. With the alternator out of the way, we can access the back of the pulley and we can basically jam a screwdriver through one of the holes in the pulley to hold it in place while we break the torque in the bolts. You'll see that in a couple of steps. Now we're going to take the belt off. To relieve the belt tension, we're going to use a 19mm wrench. We're going to use the box end on the tensioner right here. This is a hydraulic tensioner, so we're going to put the wrench over it. We're going to push towards the back of the car. We're going to go gently, slowly, and then it's going to compress a little piston, relieving the belt tension. Then we're just going to slip the belt off the alternator. I don't have enough clearance here to use any of my sockets, so I'm going to use a 19mm wrench. Ideally, you'd have one with a 0-degree offset here, but a normal box end wrench is going to be fine. So we're going to slide it over the end. You might need to pull this hard line out of the way a little bit just to get it on. And now I'll show you a little trick. We're going to use a larger 22mm wrench as a cheater to give us a little more leverage so we don't have to push so hard to take the belt tension off. So the trick here is you take the box end of your second wrench, and now you've got some extra leverage to work with. All right, we're going to push forward slowly. Careful that your cheater wrench doesn't slide off to the side. Now we're going to slide the belt off, being careful not to put our finger between the belt and any of the pulleys. And slowly release the tensioner. Remove the battery cable using a 10mm socket. Pull up on this rubber boot, push it on the clip, and pull up. Now we're going to push in on this clip here, disconnect. Ideally, this connector would just come right off that bracket. You might find that it's so seized together that you can't move it. You might risk breaking off this tab entirely. So I'm just going to take a 10mm and remove this bracket completely. Then, if you're lucky, you can pry up on this tab right here, and this will just pull off the bracket. If it doesn't, then the same thing applies. You can just take a 10mm and remove it. The alternator is held on with two 12mm bolts. There's one here on the back, just under that bracket. There's a second one down here underneath the pulley. Don't mistake that bolt with the one further forward, which holds on the tensioner. If you got a couple of extra minutes, it would be a really good idea to take some penetrating oil of your choice, spray down that bolt on the back and the one under the pulley. If you're going to do this, put down some cardboard or something to prevent overspray onto the belt and the other pulleys, and then maybe go take a break for a couple of minutes just to make your life a little bit easier. We need to remove this wire. We could take this bracket off, but there's not much clearance. Don't really have enough room to get a socket on those bolts. We could use a wrench. I'm just going to take a screwdriver, trim clip tool, or something like that. Press in on the back, wedge it a little bit, press in on the back side, wiggle a little bit, and it should pop right out. Then I'll just do the same thing for the bottom. Now we remove the two 12mm bolts. And our second bolt, you can see it's a lot shorter, and I'm going to put that in the official parts tray. And remove the alternator. If it sticks at all, you can wiggle it a little bit, or if necessary, you can use a pry bar. Let's take off the belt. This is where removing the wheel and the splash shield really pay off. The tensioner is held on with two bolts. They can be a little bit sticky sometimes, so I'm going to take some penetrating oil. I'm going to spray down this bolt here, and then I'm also going to spray down the pivot bolt for the tensioner, which you can't see right now, but I'll show you how to get to it. Here's what your tensioner looks like. This is where it bolts up next to the alternator. This is the pivot bolt. This is the one that might give you a little bit of grief. Now you might think you're going to spray around here with some penetrating oil, but that's not really going to do much because it's a pretty long bolt. What you'll need to do is spray your penetrating oil down the back where it threads into the block, you'll probably have to spray quite a bit in there. It'll run down, and then hopefully some will get into the threads. On our existing tensioner, that's the part we were talking about that bolts up next to the alternator. That's the pulley right there, so you'll want to spray your penetrating oil in there. If you were lucky earlier, you already loosened these 3 bolts on the water pump pulley. Most likely you couldn't. So here's a trick for getting them loose. You can take a screwdriver, insert it through the back into the hole. This will wedge the pulley in place. You might be able to fit a socket in there. None of mine fit, so I'm just going to take a 10mm wrench, use the box end. And then just do that 2 more times. And now we remove the bolts. Talking about luck again, if you're really lucky, you'll just be able to wiggle this off. One trick is, you push hard on one side, maybe use a pry bar, maybe tap it with a hammer, rotate 180 degrees, good news and bad news. We'll start off with the good news, which is this 12mm bolt right here. And now the bad news. This guy right here, that's your pivot bolt. It's only an 8mm Allen head bolt. The torque, the spec torque anyways, isn't that high, but after 12 years, it can be pretty hard to get out. Option number 1, breaker bar, maybe a ratchet, Allen head socket, 8mm. If you're really lucky, then you'll just put that right on there. You can come in from the top of the engine bay, and it'll just break loose. I wasn't so lucky. Twice. This one's even impact rated. Option number 2, impact gun, extension, U-joint, Allen socket. You can come in through the wheel well. You can get on the bolt, but with the U-joint, you might not get enough torque, you might not get enough impact on that bolt to get it out. Didn't work for me either. So we're going to demonstrate the third option, which is removing the passenger side motor mount, dropping the motor a couple of inches. Once this is done, you'll have direct access through the wheel well. You won't need U-joints, you won't need anything else, you can get straight on the bolt. Now there is one other thing to talk about here. There is a possibility that you might strip out the head of the bolt, or you could break the bolt itself. If you strip out the head of the bolt, then what you can do is you can drill out the head, pull the tensioner off. At this point, the bolt won't be under tension anymore. You have direct access to the base of the threads. You can spray it down with penetrating oil. You can apply heat directly to the threads. With any luck, vice grips, it'll come right out. The real nightmare scenario is if the bolt breaks off in the block. If that happens, your only option is to drill it out, tap it, and hope that you go in flush to the surface, and then your tensioner goes on straight. Normally we don't cheat these repairs, you're seeing them as we do them. This time we cheated. We had to cheat. I had a hard time getting this off. It took me about a week of alternating between some penetrating oil, hitting with the impact gun, applying heat, just over and over again, just a little bit every day, and eventually it just popped loose. Now all this said, we're not trying to dissuade anyone from trying this. It's just all about the patience. There's no easier way to break a bolt and strip out a head than just pushing too hard, or maybe backing off for a bit when you should let it sit for a bit with some oil on it. So just approach this with patience, don't push your luck, and just take your time. We're going to support the engine using a jack under the oil pan. It's a good idea to use something like a block of wood, or in this case, a hockey puck, between the jack and the oil pan. Now we're not actually lifting anything here. You're just going to raise it up until it's just touching the oil pan. We don't want to actually bear any weight yet. Remove 17mm bolts here, here, and here. Pull out. and put aside. Another 17mm bolt right here. 19mm bolt here, 19mm nut here. One extra note, if there's a lot of corrosion and rust built up right here, take a wire brush first and just try to clean it off a little bit. You don't want to risk this nut jamming halfway off. Now, to get this thing off here, you might need to jack up the engine just a little bit. Right now there's some tension on that stud there, and you won't be able to slide it off. Now we can drop the engine just a little bit, just until we can see that bolt through the wheel well. Go slow dropping the engine, it shouldn't go too far. So just to reiterate, this is a worst case scenario here. We want to avoid doing this if at all possible, but in our case, this was necessary to be able to get that bolt out. So now you can see it's just dropped below the frame here, so we can get on it with an impact and we should be able to remove it. And there she is. And here's the tensioner. Here's the new tensioner. We did so much damage to that bolt getting it out that we've got a new one. This is an M10 by 1.25mm bolt, but you can also get this from Honda. We have a parts number we'll put in the description. It was only about $4. That's up here in Canada, so that's probably about 25 cents for most of you guys. And we're just going to install a new one. Torque the pivot bolt to 40 foot-pounds. Now for the 12mm bolt. Which we are torquing to 17 foot-pounds. Put the tensioner pulley back on. Now we're going to torque the 3 pulley bolts to 10 foot-pounds. We're going to use a similar trick as before. We're going to take a screwdriver, jam it in there. We're going to put the motor mount back on now. If you didn't have to drop the motor in the first place, you can skip ahead a bit. Otherwise, we'll get through this pretty quick. First, we're going to jack the motor back up so it's about level. Slide on this bracket. Now we're going to put on the 19mm nut. We're not going to tighten that yet. Next, we're going to line up this back hole. Put in the second 19mm. But leave it a little bit loose. You might have to pull the motor towards you a little bit to make this last hole line up. Now, if this bolt binds up a little bit, you can just kind of shake the motor gently a little bit just to make sure that there's no tension on it from the bracket. Now we're going to torque these guys up. 52 foot-pounds, 52 foot-pounds, 54 foot-pounds. Now, one extra note, the manual does call for these 2 bolts, or this bolt and this nut, to be replaced. I'm not going to do that here right now, but it might be a good idea for you to use new bolts on an installation. The long bolt goes in the back, and same as the 2 on the motor down there, Honda does call for these 3 bolts to be replaced. And this bracket goes on the left like this. And now we'll torque all 3 brand new bolts to 47 foot-pounds. And now we're done with the jack. Motor didn't fall out, looks good. Before we go any further, we're going to make sure that our new belt is the same length as the old one. There's nothing worse than getting deep into a project only to find out you have the wrong part. Perfect, looks good. Before we install the new belt, there is one thing to know. If you've got a 2006 Civic, there was a TSB issued because of an issue they were having with breaking pivot bolts. Part of the recall was that they changed the routing of the belt, so you might see a diagram in your user manual, or there might be something on the hood that shows you how the belt's supposed to be routed. That's actually changed, so you'll want to follow the new steps and not the old one. Also, you might find that the belt length is actually slightly different because of the new routing. This car here has hydraulic power steering. If you have EPS, then there's going to be a different routing. We'll include that in the notes. You know you have hydraulic power steering if there's a power steering reservoir up here. We're going to start on the left by running around the power steering pump. We'll leave the power steering pump, go up over the crank, come up off the crank, go around the tensioner and back down. After the tensioner, we're going to go around the crank. Leave the crank and go up over the water pump. Then from the water pump, it's down around the AC pulley or compressor pulley. So we'll just put that in place. The long bolt goes in the back like that. The shorter bolt goes underneath the pulley. We're going to torque both bolts to 17 foot-pounds. And the bottom bolt is 17 foot-pounds as well. We're going to use the same 19mm box end wrench as before. Grab our 22 to use as a cheater. And slowly compress that piston. Take the belt, being very careful not to get your finger between the belt and the pulley. Slide it over the alternator and slowly let off on the wrench. Now we're going to reconnect all the cables and brackets. Alright, we're going to take that cable we disconnected before, and we're going to push those white clips back in. And we're going to reinstall this bracket. Now we'll reconnect the battery. Positive lead goes first. And now the ground. All right, let's put the wheel back on. And then 80 foot-pounds. All right, we're gonna install the splash shield. I've got the surviving clips. I've got a case of generic clips. I bought these online. They're not very expensive. They're worth having lying around if you're gonna do this more than once. And now we're just gonna pop it back in. Reinserting all 12 clips. Reinsert the tabs on both sides in the front of the fender. And then 2 clips per side. So we had our battery disconnected, which means that your radio might be in anti-theft mode. You'll know this is the case if you try to turn it on and you just get enter code on the screen. If you don't know how to unlock your radio, then we've got another video covering this and we'll include a link in the description.
Okay, so that didn't go as good as we hoped. It took a lot longer than we thought, but we hope that this video saved you a ton of time and saved you a ton of money. If this really helped you out, please like the video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Until next time, fear no fix.